Hello. I'll start with one event that took place in Russia, the meeting of the Defense Ministry Board. Belousov, the defense minister of that country, the minister of killing of the Russian Federation, stated that Russia's key task for the next year is to preserve and increase the pace of the offensive it has already gained, although the pace is indeed not as high as they would like. And now, as you can see, there are statements from both Ukraine and Russia that both sides are ready to fight. Therefore, when we hear about plans for war in 2026, it does not mean that everyone wants to fight. What does Belousov say? He claims that the policies of European countries and NATO create real prerequisites for continuing military actions in 2026. Belousov also emphasized that NATO is preparing for a military clash with Russia. Well, yes, NATO is preparing for a possible Russian attack on NATO. That is completely normal, but it is being presented differently, as if NATO is about to attack Russia. They probably don't really believe it themselves, but they spread this kind of propaganda. What does Belousov say verbatim? It is not us who threaten NATO. We are being threatened, he says. NATO's annual budget will increase by more than 1.5 times, to $2.7 trillion. That's a good thing. It means Europeans will allocate $1.7 trillion, even slightly more, for their own defense. This is a very positive signal. Preparations of NATO's joint forces for an armed confrontation with Russia by 2030 have begun. Yes, Europe expects a Russian attack on European countries that are NATO members, and not only them. Russia's West grouping has taken Kupiansk, taken it again, although we know the situation there is not like that at all. Russian troops are repelling attempts by the armed forces of Ukraine to retake the city. He also says that nearly 500,000 servicemen have been lost, and that nearly 410,000 people joined the Russian military under contract in 2025. 2/3 of them are under 40 years old. In fact, he is confirming that a huge number of Russians are simply being used up at the front. In Ukraine, he says, more than 70% of thermal power plants and more than 37% of hydroelectric power plants have been disabled. Indeed, the situation in Odessa region is difficult. I have doubts about the percentages, although it is true that the energy situation in Ukraine is extremely challenging. He also says that a security zone is being created in Kharkiv and Sumy regions. The threat of our armed forces entering Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk regions has been reduced, he says. We probably are not planning to go there anyway. Although there was already an operation in Kursk region to reduce Russia's potential in other directions, it also turns out that the Kremlin is ready to discuss the deployment of European troops in Ukraine. Peskov stated this when answering a question about the possible deployment of forces of the Coalition of the Willing, because the discussion really is about European troops, not about troops from China, South America, or Africa that could be part of a peacekeeping contingent, for example in a demilitarized zone, but specifically about the deployment of European troops in Ukraine. Western plans to deploy European troops in Ukraine to monitor compliance with a ceasefire agreement may be a subject of negotiations, says Putin's mouthpiece. What does he say verbatim? Regarding foreign military contingents, here he seems to generalize, not only European troops, but foreign contingents on Ukrainian territory. And that, friends, is definitely not about peacekeepers. Our position is well known. It has been articulated by the President and at other working levels. It is well known, absolutely consistent, and clear. At the same time, he hints that they are against it, but says that it is still a subject for discussion. So, friends, the Russian side is leaving room for maneuver in negotiations. Peskov says one thing, Putin another, Belousov a third. This is a deliberate negotiating game. It is not some rigid position. This is my personal opinion. Please share yours as well. By the way, we just discussed this on air on Channel 24. A bit later, I'll leave that video here so you can watch it. Putin also spoke there and said that all the goals of the so-called SMO will be achieved and unconditionally fulfilled. Russia can increase the pace of the offensive in Ukraine. Honestly, I strongly doubt that. If they could, they would have already done so. He also says they did not start the war in 2022. Apparently it was aliens, but that the West itself started this war. Maybe he meant provoked, but he said started. That is a lie. Then he says that Ukrainian statehood, judging by golden toilet bowls, is collapsing. Russians heavily exploit the topic of corruption in Ukraine, and unfortunately, it does exist. He claims that European piglets joined the Biden administration in hopes of benefiting from the collapse of our country. They wanted to reclaim what they lost in previous historical periods and sought revenge. Russia, Putin says, will acquire, not produce, but acquire, new means of destruction that will not appear anywhere else in the world for a long time. I just don't understand where they will acquire them. Maybe Ukraine is producing them. He also says that, as before, they are ready to negotiate and resolve all emerging issues peacefully. Again, friends, the same story. We will fight, but we want negotiations. While negotiations are ongoing, the war continues. This is Russia's position. They do not withdraw from negotiations, and Putin says that the U.S. administration demonstrates readiness for talks. We hope the same will happen in Europe. It is inevitable. That is, Putin claims negotiations are inevitable, even with Europeans. He also says they insist on the fulfillment of promises that were allegedly made to them. Who made them? Where? When? I honestly cannot say. He refers to public statements that NATO would not expand eastward and claims that no one cared. He often repeats this. Yet he launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. No such assurances were ever given to Putin. It was Putin and Xi Jinping who decided in 2022 to prevent NATO's eastward expansion. But once the full-scale invasion began, two countries, Finland and Sweden, joined NATO, and our cooperation with the alliance became even closer. Europeans now unanimously say that Ukraine's security is part of Euro-Atlantic security, including that of the United States. And in the U.S., increasingly loud voices say they are not going to abandon Ukraine. Although I see many different opinions now, like saying Trump won't wait, but it's not that simple, friends. Putin also said that Russia allegedly prefers a diplomatic settlement of the war. However, if Ukraine and its partners refuse substantive talks, Moscow is ready to continue seizing territory by military means. He also once again promised to put the Oreshnik system on combat duty by the end of the year. They just can't seem to get Oreshnik working. He again talks about eliminating the so-called root causes of the war, claiming they don't exist. But if you think honestly, he contradicts himself, because by his own logic, he is fighting on Russian territory, on the territory of 5 regions he has declared part of the Russian Federation. Yet he says that things aren't working out in Ukraine. In general, everything is as usual. Nothing new, just propaganda. Unfortunately, friends, it works. I would now like to discuss with you an interesting statement by Peskov regarding the possible deployment of European military forces in Ukraine after an agreement to freeze the war. Just today, the Kremlin said it is ready to discuss the deployment of European troops in Ukraine. Specifically, Peskov said this when answering a question about decisions by the coalition of the willing regarding a military contingent. We know that the British are allegedly ready. Keir Starmer has said so, as has Zelensky, and that the French are also being discussed. Peskov said, "Regarding foreign military contingents on the territory of Ukraine, our position is well known. It has been formulated by the President and at other working levels. It is well known, consistent, and clear. But again, this is a subject for discussion." I interpret his words as a readiness to talk about the deployment of some kind of military contingent, but not necessarily from NATO countries, or perhaps definitely not from NATO countries. So how should we interpret this? At first glance, it looks like the Kremlin may be ready to accept the deployment of European or even NATO troops in Ukraine. Is that really so? It's hard to say what will actually happen. For Ukraine, the best security guarantee would indeed be the deployment of a foreign contingent along a frozen front line, because that is the only way to prevent Russia from attacking again without triggering a third world war. We understand that both China and Russia are preparing for such a scenario together, but how this would be implemented is the key question. When Russia talks about a foreign contingent in Ukraine, it usually means a Chinese contingent on occupied Ukrainian territories. This has long been a goal of Xi Jinping. Beyond supporting Russia's territorial gains and exploiting Ukraine's resource base, China and Russia aim to undermine NATO's security from Belarus to Georgia via occupied Ukrainian territory and to weaken NATO as a phenomenon. China and Russia signed agreements in 2022 opposing NATO's eastward expansion. China generally hates NATO and opposes any NATO presence in East Asia, even though East Asia itself often invites NATO engagement. This is geopolitics. If we imagine some kind of buffer zone controlled under a Korean peninsula-style model with a contingent enforcing a ceasefire, there are two options. The ideal option for Ukraine is that this zone is controlled exclusively by Euro-Atlantic democracies, mainly NATO members. For Russia, the ideal option is control by its allies, Chinese, Iranians, Venezuelans, and others. A possible compromise that Russia, or rather China through Russia, might propose is the presence of Chinese troops alongside Europeans. Why is this beneficial for China? First, it would give China a legal military presence in Europe, on NATO and EU borders. Second, it would grant access to enormous amounts of data and information exchanged within such cooperation. Chinese intelligence would deploy surveillance technologies, gadgets, and massively collect intelligence. This would create vast opportunities for their security services to influence and recruit Ukrainians. Recruitment is one of the biggest threats to national security. Russian agents already work on this, but they lack the resources and capabilities of the Chinese Communist Party. In this sense, China is far more dangerous than Russia. China views Ukraine as a future black hole of Europe, worse than Hungary. According to this plan, Ukraine would degrade after a frozen war, with pro-Russian and pro-Chinese forces coming to power after Ukraine joins the EU. Once Ukraine is an EU member, it gains access to EU institutions. From China's perspective, Ukraine is corrupt enough to allow easy recruitment of politicians and officials to undermine Brussels from within. Sadly, given Ukraine's internal problems, this risk exists. That is the Chinese strategy. This is why China is not strongly opposed to Ukraine's EU accession under these conditions, as long as Chinese forces are also present. There is a third option, a UN mandate with a broad range of countries, Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. This is less effective. A NATO-led mission would be far more efficient. Still, a UN mission would be better than Chinese control of occupied territories in preparation for future attacks. I don't see this option being publicly discussed, though it may exist behind closed doors. In any case, I do not think Ukraine would agree to a buffer zone not backed by credible forces. Nor would the U.S. accept it. Washington needs to secure Ukraine and Europe to close this issue and move on to other strategic goals of Donald Trump. So, can we assume that Peskov's statement about foreign contingents is a hint that China will be more actively involved in negotiations, possibly even hosting a signing ceremony in Beijing, with Xi Jinping symbolically dominating Ukrainian officials? That is clearly something Beijing would want, to break Ukraine as a symbol of freedom for East Asia, even more than for Europe. Xi Jinping would love to throw Ukraine's head at the feet of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other democracies. In reality, China is already deeply involved. Any real Russian move is coordinated with the Chinese Communist Party. Russia is incapable of acting against China's interests. There has not been a single precedent in 4 years. This will not change. Russia cannot afford to break with China, and China does not want Russia to stop its confrontations, not only in Ukraine, but elsewhere. We see what is happening with Japan and other regions. The groundwork for new wars is being laid, and very soon.